Hello, I'm Larry Wilson, and welcome to the Wake Up broadcast for August 2004. Today I'm going to do my best to finish our study on Daniel chapter 7. Each of the 5 prophecies in the book of Daniel are so filled with information and wonderful things to examine, it's very hard to finish any study on the book of Daniel. But as we begin today, there are 3 things I want you to carefully and thoughtfully consider. Let's go to the computer screen and begin with item number 1. Pay close attention to this first sentence. The vision in Daniel 7 presents a sequence of events that are in chronological order. This means we have a reliable way to track the orderly progression of God's plans. See, if they're not in order, then who's going to put them in chronological order for you? If God didn't do it in the Bible, then what man would be qualified to do this? The answer is none. God put the sequence of events in their order so that we would have a reliable way to track the progression, the forward movement of His plans, because they're all pointing to the time of the end. For example, in verse 4 of Daniel 7, we have the kingdom represented by the lion. In verse 5, we have the kingdom represented by the bear. In verse 6, we have the kingdom represented by the leopard, the Grecians, the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Grecians. Verse 7, we have the 4th beast, the monster beast, the terrible beast, representing the kingdom of Rome. In verse 8, we have the 10 horns that divide up the Roman Empire. Then in verse 8, toward the latter half of the verse, we have the rise of the little horn that plucks up 3 of the 10 horns. And then we have the judgment scene where the court was seated and the books were opened. Then in verse 11, we have the little horn boasting. And then in verse 11, in the end of the verse, we have the beast is burned in the fire. Chronological order. You may remember Rule 1 says, each apocalyptic prophecy has a beginning and ending point in time, and the events occur within the given order. In other words, in Daniel 7, we have a beginning point in time, 605 BC, and the events occur in the order in which they are given. This allows us to move prophetically and historically and chronologically toward the destruction of the beast, the terrible monster, and the other beasts as well at the second coming. This is an important concept that you have to understand, because Rule 1 is a fundamental method of interpretation, a valid rule of interpretation. And regardless of which prophecy we may be working on, there are 5 in Daniel and 12 in Revelation, all of them conform and follow this architecture. The second thing I want you to consider is that God has linked events in heaven with events on earth. so that we can determine our location within the sequence of events. You may recall I've talked at length about the heaven-earth linkage law, which simply means that because we can't see into heaven, God has linked events on earth with events in heaven so that we can determine our location in the sequence, the prophetic sequence of events. In other words, if you know what events to look for on earth, you can know what is taking place in heaven. Now, we're going to go through the chronology of Daniel 7 once again, and as we go through it, notice where the judgment scene in heaven is positioned. This is crucial to today's study. We start in 605 BC with the lion, which represents the kingdom of Babylon. Then we move to 539 BC with the bear, representing the kingdoms of the Medes and the Persians. Then we move to 331 BC, the kingdom of the leopard, with 4 heads. Alexander the Great's empire was divided to his 4 generals. Then we come to 168 BC, and we have the appearing of the monster beast, which is representing Rome. And then we have 476 AD. We have the implosion of the Roman Empire by the 10 ethnic divisions of the empire. 476 AD, Rome falls, is sacked and burned. Then we have the rise of the little horn power, which is 538 AD. And I'll say more about that later on, that date. We know who the little horn power is. We've discussed that at length. Then in verse 9, we have the judgment scene. Now, the critical point here is notice where the judgment scene is located. It's located in verse 9, which is between verse 8 and verse 11. And we know that verse 8 occurred in 538 AD. We know that the judgment scene occurred in 1798, and we know that the little horn will begin boasting when the Great Tribulation begins. And we know that the beast will be burned in the fire, that is the terrible beast, the monster beast, and all the others as well, at the second coming. Again, I want you to point out, notice where the judgment scene is located. We will examine this in more detail, but I just want to highlight this as we begin. The chronological location of the judgment scene in heaven forces it to occur after the little horn has come to power, but before the little horn is seen boasting again. Did you notice? The judgment scene occurs after the little horn has come to power, and then it receives a wound, a deadly wound. But then the Revelation tells us that the deadly wound will be healed. And in fact, Daniel 7, verse 11, tells us Daniel saw the little horn boasting again. That is yet to come. I'll show you why as we proceed in our study today. The third point I want you to consider is that the little horn power in Daniel 7 is the Roman Catholic Church. We have demonstrated this many times, and I won't go over it again today, but there is only one entity on earth that can meet the specifications of the little horn power in Daniel 7, and that is, without a doubt, the Roman Catholic Church. And history fully confirms the authority of the Pope over the nations of Europe began in 538 with the fall of the third horn, or kingdom. Remember, 3 were plucked up with the fall of the Ostrogoths. The vision in Daniel 7 indicates that the little horn would persecute the saints for 1260 days, which is a time, 360, times 720, and half a time, 180. This all adds up to 1260 days. And we know this is true because the same thing is restated in Revelation chapter 12, verses 6 and 14. Now, you may recall Rule 4, which indicates that God is translating apocalyptic time according to His Jubilee calendar. Prophetic time periods between 1437 BC, the Exodus, and 1994 are translated a day for a year. So the 1260 days have to be translated as 1260 years. Look at Daniel 7, verse 25. The angel told Daniel, he, that is the little horn, will speak against the Most High and oppress His saints and try to change the set times and the laws. And the saints will be handed over to him for a time, times, and half a time. This time period is huge, more than 12 centuries in length. More than 12 centuries. So you're not going to move it around very easily in human history, and you're not going to find any other power on earth that persecutes the saints and tries to change God's laws and the times set for worship. No other entity on earth but the Roman Catholic Church will meet this obligation or this specification. Here's an interesting point. The vision in Daniel 7 does not indicate when the 1260 years would begin. There's no heaven-earth linkage indicating when it would begin. Perhaps God did not reveal when the 1260 years would begin, so that the people living during the Dark Ages would not be overwhelmed with discouragement. What would you have thought if you had lived back then and you heard a preacher say that there was only 1,000 years of more persecution to go? Oh, you would give up. So God didn't tell, nor did He let His children understand the prophecy of Daniel 7:25, because they would have been overwhelmed with the reality of 1,260 years of persecution. God waited until we nearly came to the end of the 1,260 years before He allowed the meaning of Daniel 7:25 to be fully understood. Because the vision does say, Daniel 7, the vision does say that the persecution will stop after 1,260 years, and the judgment scene in heaven is linked to the end of the 1,260 years of persecution. Now, as you've already noticed, I'm putting emphasis on the judgment scene. This is important. This judgment scene is positioned right in the middle of several earthly events. And what God has done is, by lining up these sequence, this chronological order, we can determine and discover and calculate when the judgment scene that Daniel saw in verses 9 and 10 took place. And as you will see later on in today's seminar, that this is a very highly important matter to understand. So the vision in Daniel 7:25 indicates that the persecution will stop after 1260 years. The little horn power would be broken. The persecution would come to an end. The judgment scene would then take place in heaven. And the judgment scene and the cessation of persecution on earth are linked together. So when we see persecution come to its end, we know something has happened in heaven because of the way God has linked an event on earth with an event in heaven. Understanding this judgment scene in Daniel 7 is crucial. It plays a crucial part in understanding the larger picture of Daniel as well as the larger picture in Revelation. Because we can't see into heaven and observe things taking place, God has generously linked events in heaven with events on earth so that we can know the timing of events in heaven compared with the prophetic fulfillment of events on earth. In Daniel 7:25, the scripture says that the saints would be handed over to the little horn for a time, times, and half a time. But look at the next verse, verse 26. But the court will sit, and his power, that is the little horn, will be taken away. In other words, when you see the power and the authority given to the Roman Catholic Church brought to a close, you know that the court did it in heaven. The judgment scene in heaven is how this took place. I hope you are following this. You know, while I'm thinking about it, let me go to Daniel chapter 7, verse 9, and let me read this scene for you so that you can follow what I'm saying. In fact, I'm going to start reading at verse 8 just so that you can, I want to read these 3 verses so that you can see the flow. Daniel says, while I was thinking about the 10 horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. These 3 horns represent the Ostrogoths, the Heruli, and the Vandals. These are the 3 ethnic tribal nations which the papacy uprooted over the heresy of the Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity. The 3 horns, these 3 nations, did not believe that Jesus Christ was co-eternal with the Father. And the Catholic Church took them to task for this, using its political influence, and was able to uproot the heresy. And as a result, Justinian, the emperor of Rome at the time, gave the Pope the official title as corrector of heretics for his stand and his influence and the use of his authority to remove this heresy out of the Roman Empire. So, Daniel says he noticed that the little horn uprooted 3 of the 10 horns. And this horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. Okay, so we know about this horn power. It had eyes like the eyes of a man, indicating that it could see things the other horns couldn't see. And it spoke boastfully in a way that the other horns did not speak. That's because this horn, the Roman Catholic Church, was a religious power, whereas the other 7 horns were political powers. Now, as Daniel is watching this transpire, he looked up into heaven and he saw thrones set in place. In fact, in Revelation chapters 4 In 5, we read it was actually 25 thrones that were arranged. The Ancient of Days, the Father, takes his seat in the center, and the 24 thrones are set in a circle around him. The Ancient of Days, Daniel says, his clothing was as white as snow, and the hair of his head was white like wool, and his throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. Wheels representing here circles of angels who encircle the throne. A river of fire was flowing. This is a procession of angels coming out from before him. 10,000 upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. This judgment scene, this courtroom scene, where the books were opened, where the Ancient of Days takes his seat, the timing of this and the importance of this cannot be understated. This is a crucial development, but it happens in heaven, and we can't see it. Therein is part of the problem. What people don't see, pun intended, they don't understand. After this court is seated and the books were opened, Daniel's eyes returned to earth, and he continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. And I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. So this beast is going to be destroyed at the second coming, and the little horn is going to speak boastfully after the judgment scene occurs. Chronological order. Now we know in verse 25, the Bible predicts that the saints will be handed over to the little horn for a time, times, and half a time. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away. In other words, when you see the little horn power broken, brought to an end, you know that the time, times, and half a time have been terminated because the court took his power away. This is really not very difficult, but it does require careful understanding. The point again is that the court took away the power of the little horn. It just didn't happen on its own. Twice in Daniel 7, verse 26 and verse 21, the angel emphasizes to Daniel that the power of the little horn will be terminated by court order. The Father is going to issue a court order. Notice Daniel 7:21. Daniel says, as I watched, this horn, that is the little horn, was waging war against who? The saints. And how are the saints doing? The Bible says the little horn was defeating them until, verse 22 begins with the word until. Until the Ancient of Days came and took his seat and pronounced judgment. In other words, he actually pronounced a restraining order in favor of the saints of the Most High. Please notice that the saints were being defeated by the little horn as he was waging war against them until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in their favor. What I have just pointed out here is a linkage of three important things. Let's go to my little drawing pad here, and let's see if I can put this in a little picture form for you. Okay, here's 1,260 years. Okay? We don't know exactly where it begins, and we don't know exactly where it ends until the time comes for it to end, because when we see the little horn brought down, we know that it happened because the court scene in heaven caused it to happen. The Father took his seat and pronounced judgment, and the little horn was then broken. Its power and the 1260 came to an end, and we know that the Roman Catholic Church suffered a fatal wound during the French Revolution in February of 1798. That tells us when the backing up 1260 years, that tells us that the power of the papacy began, as far as God is concerned, in the year 538 AD. And what is interesting about the year 538 AD is that that's the year that the Ostrogoths fall. The third horn, the three nations, over a heresy, come to their end. So the little horn, the papacy, the Roman Catholic Church, persecutes the saints of God for 1260 years. God ordains this, and then he brings the power of the papacy down during the French Revolution. General Waller took the Pope into exile in February 14, 1798, and we know that that is linked to the courtroom scene in heaven because the Ancient of Days has pronounced judgment in favor of the saints. So we have several things linked together that are large and huge, can't be moved around. The identities can't be shifted if you take all the specifications into consideration. And we have an airtight case for locating the judgment scene in heaven in 1798. I hope that this makes sense to you. The little horn would persecute until the Ancient of Days pronounced judgment. That's precisely what the Bible says. The little horn would wage war against the saints and defeat them until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment, a restraining order in favor of the saints of the Most High. And after 1798, when the papacy receives a fatal wound, we know that a healing of the deadly wound is going to take place, and we know that the papacy will once again speak very boastfully because it's all predicted, both in Daniel and Revelation. The heaven-earth linkage law cannot be dismissed or diminished. It is important, and it's important in our understanding to see that God has linked things in heaven with things on earth so that we can understand that things on earth just don't happen. They happen when God is ready for them to happen. Not by the prowess of man, but by the authority of God. Well, we've run out of time for this segment, but we will continue. So please stay tuned, and we will continue in just a moment.